Hi, I'm Christian, and welcome to Dark Portents. I have Whitney with me on the channel for the first time, and today we're going to be discussing 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. This is Whitney's pick for the channel to discuss, and so she's going to give us a quick synopsis of the story without giving too much away, because we are doing a spoiler-free segment of this discussion, and the spoiler segment will come later. So,
this is the author's epic tale of 7 generations of the Buendia family and the founding of the Macondo town, a fictional town that they made in Colombia. It goes over the span of time period from the 1820s to the 1920s, and it covers post-colonialism in Latin America and the turbulent history. It kind of goes along with it, even though it's not, whatever. Anyway, it kind of goes along with it. And rise of imperialism.
So, let's, I guess, first talk about what our overall enjoyment of the book was. Did you enjoy reading 100 Years of Solitude? Is this your this was your second time reading it, right?
Yes.
And?
Yes, I really enjoyed it, and I picked up on a lot of things that I didn't pick up on the first time.
So, yeah, so I've been reading it for the first time on your recommendation. Probably a lot of our first few My Pick, Your Pick for books are going to be one of us rereading it and the other reading it for the first time. And I did really enjoy it, although I've got to say, this goes into kind of the next topic I wanted to talk about. The characters were a little bit hard to follow, because following 17 generations of this family, it very realistically had them naming their kids after themselves, and then those kids naming their kids after their parents and grandparents, and so like everybody had the same 3 or 4 names, and it was a little hard to keep apart, especially because the different generations were living together in the same house, and
yes,
and it would go back and forth between Jose Arcadio and Jose Arcadio Buendia and Arcadio and Jose and this and that, and they all had the same names.
It is actually quite confusing. Sometimes you'll have to reread things several times just to figure out which one you're dealing with.
Yes. Yeah. At some points, I just gave up on trying to figure that out and just followed the story and waited for context clues to clue me in. But aside from the very realistic and confusing naming conventions of this book, and I see why authors of fantasy usually go with something a little less realistic, and every character in most fantasy has a different name. Aside from that, what did you think of the characters?
I really liked the characters and the character development. I liked the situations characters were put in. I liked how, magical realism played its role with character development.
Can you elaborate on that without spoilers?
I like how things that happened with characters would be totally not realistic, but they would be told in ways that were realistic. And how, characters would worry about something that, and it'd be seen as a common worry. They'd be like, oh, this is going to happen if this happens. And they'd be really worried about it, but it's just something totally, outside of reality.
So I think that without getting into too much spoilers, because I'll drop a little tiny bit of this, because it's something that is established very early on at the beginning of the book, so I don't consider it really a spoiler. They are constantly worrying about the idea that that if they marry the wrong people, especially if they're cousins, even distant cousins, that the children will be born with the tail of a pig.
That's actually what I was thinking of when I said that.
And it's seen as totally normal, that totally normal concern that your child could be born with the tail of a pig if you are related to the person, even distantly, that you're breeding with, which happens a lot in the book. I think we won't go into whether or not that actually plays out or pays off, but the fact that this is a common worry in the world is interesting. I mean, it does mirror in the real world, obviously. If you get to if your family tree, looks too much like just a tree trunk standing up, you will have birth defects and things like that. Though as far as I know, nobody's ever been born with the tail of a pig. Yeah. I really liked the characters as well. I mostly understood their motivations, and I saw like the patterns of like different branches of the family and different like character traits kind of going down the generations. Yeah, and a lot of their motivations made a lot of sense. Sometimes they didn't, but for the most part, I liked them, and they were pretty believable. And let's see, what do you think about the pacing and the writing style?
I really like it. I think it flows really well. Sometimes it went a little fast in parts, and then sometimes it was a little slow. But overall, I think it flowed really well.
Yeah, the pacing, to me, it was a little hard to deal with. There were a few points where it dragged, and I don't know if I would have finished it if I wasn't reading it for YouTube channel. It would be painstakingly slow, and then just suddenly, bam, like tons of development and action, like really fast, like, and it was a little bit jarring. And then there was like a moment towards the end of the book where it felt like, oh, this is the climax, and this is like what it's all been building to. And then like that action was over much quicker than you feel like it's going to be, and it just kind of like is done, and then we're like back to like doing build up and like slower stuff. It was not a traditionally paced narrative or traditionally structured narrative, which goes into magical realism.
Yes, that's common in magical realism. And actually, the first time I read it, there were parts that I read it so fast. It was just like, I was just like flowing through it. And then I would be stuck on like 50 pages for like, honestly, months the first time. And I set it down, and then I picked it back up and I finished it. So this time it was much easier because I knew what was going to happen. I knew that it was going to be that way, and I knew the ending. And it's no spoilers, but it's a very good book. The ending's really phenomenal.
Yeah. So do you think that the story like had something interesting to say, or was unique in any way? Like,
yes, absolutely. I think that it's a very deep story, and I think a lot of it you don't even realize how deep it is. The first time I was reading it, I had no idea about all of the historical layers and things that were being brought in by Gabriel García Márquez, and it's really beautiful. Yeah, I think it has a lot to say and a lot to offer the world.
Yeah, it had a lot to say about obsession, about like traditional values versus like more like what some people might consider open-mindedness. It had a lot to say about politics. Towards the end, it had a lot to say about class struggle. It had a lot to say about the nature of war and what it means to be a soldier or a general. There was quite a bit about like what it means, I imagine, to be a Colombian during that particular period in Colombian history, and what it means to be to be a Christian for those characters that were, because there were quite a few characters who were Catholic and very and some of them were more stout in their Catholicism than others, and dealt with a lot of those things. So what do you think about the way that foreshadowing was used in the book?
It's really interesting, and sometimes the characters would do things that would be like, we're doing this for this reason, we're giving this to our next generation so that they can have these other things. Like sometimes it'll flat out tell you what's going to happen before it does.
Oh yeah, there's a specific one that I want to bring up that where foreshadowing was brought up many times over the same
Right.
event, and then
Yes.
and then when it happens, it's, despite the fact that it's been foreshadowed the whole time, it doesn't feel like a spoiler because what ends up happening is a big twist on that,
Yes.
which we will talk about in the spoiler section. Um, did you have anything else to say, spoiler free, about magical realism?
Not really. Not right now.
Okay. Do you want to explain what magical realism is, maybe? Because this book is held up as a perfect example. Like, if you read articles about magical realism, pretty much every article, as we found out today, because we looked it up thanks to one of our commenters wanting us to talk about it, pretty much every article about magical realism is like, best example, 100 Years of Solitude. Whatever. So maybe give us a quick definition of magical realism for our viewers who may not know.
Magical realism, it is writing a book that seems like it could be our world. It's very familiar to us. It seems very normal, but then there's something fantastical that happens, like maybe a ghost is talking to you, or somebody's floating up in the air, and it's seen as normal in the book, and it's not, they do not talk about it in the book as magic. It's just because the authors want there to be this normalcy that stays with it.
Right. As opposed to something like if you want to talk about, like, fantasy, which is what we often talk about on the channel, there's like low fantasy where you have an Earth-like setting, but then when magic happens, it's often rare, it's often something most people don't know about, and they know that it's magic when they see it, and it's treated as this supernatural thing that's external to the daily reality. Or high fantasy, magic is incorporated into the daily reality, but it still both feels like a fantasy setting. It doesn't feel like you're reading about real life, which 100 Years of Solitude does feel like you're reading about real life. And even these characters who live with daily manifestations of magic, for the most part in high fantasy, they know it's magic, or they know it's, the one power, like in the Wheel of Time, or allomancy in Mistborn, or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of the difference there between like high fantasy, low fantasy, magic realism.
Yes, in magical realism, it was, there's elements of it in lots of folk and mythology and things like that. And I mean, look at Shakespeare. There's definitely some with ghosts talking and whatever, but it wasn't really, it was in Latin America and Latin American authors that really coined the term and really perfected the art of magical realism.
Right. And this is the first book that I've really read that I can, at least as an adult, that I can think of that uses this this magical realism. And I have to say it was kind of jarring because at many points in the narrative, you'll go so long without anything magical happening that you feel more like you're just reading, like, a slice of life in Colombia in the real world. And then, out of nowhere, you're reminded that there is a fantasy or a supernatural element here when something, supernatural or magical, or whatever the case may be, happens. And it was, because I'm not used to it, it was like, oh, hold on, wait a minute, this is kind of a fantasy book. And I didn't have that word magical realism to call it or identify it as or categorize it as. So it was just like, I was just like, it's a fantasy book, but it feels real. This is kind of weird, but I like it. I quite enjoyed it.
Yes, I actually read a book recently, right before we did this reread. I read Beloved by Toni Morrison.
Okay.
And it also uses magical realism, so I was like already in the game for it.
Right on. Well, hopefully I can, get into a little bit more magical realism as we continue to go through some of these books for the channel. So why, aside from what we've already talked about, do you have anything to say about why people should pick up 100 Years of Solitude? And I guess part of that is, who would you recommend this book to?
It's a literary masterpiece, so if you like literature, I recommend it. If you like studying different elements of fantasy and just seeing like a world with magical realism in it, if you're interested in seeing what that's like, this is honestly a work of art as much as it is a book. Okay, and who would you recommend the book to? Besides, I guess, people who are into literature. What else? Honestly, I would recommend it to artists. and musicians. There's a lot of magical realism that kind of ties to the romanticism and into the arts in general.
Right on. Yeah, I would recommend this book to anybody who wants to who is interested in Latin American history and like looking at the political history and the class struggle stuff, but wants to take a break from nonfiction and get into a little bit of the, both getting a picture of like some of the culture of Colombia, but also getting, a little bit into, more of a fictional presentation of that history. And then also, like, if you're a fantasy reader, if you like reading fiction and you want to see if magical realism is for you, or if like something that delves a little bit more into these topics of culture, history, militarism, class struggle, in what feels less like the more removed way in which fantasy often deals with those topics by showing us worlds that are more explicitly not the world that we live in. If you want to try that on for size, 100 Years of Solitude is a good place to go for that.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I think it's time to move into spoilers. So what did you think about the Civil War and the treatment of the military conflict between the liberals and the conservatives that plagued Mercando and Colombia throughout a lot of this book?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting. It seemed like this really drawn out affair, and we're doing spoilers here. So there's these, it seems like there's this really just side, and there's this struggle, and then I think it's kind of reminiscent of modern politics when one side, when the liberal side was just like, oh, okay, we'll just sign these papers and do this now, and it felt almost anticlimactic at the end. What did you think?
Oh yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about that. So one thing I thought was interesting was the way that it really showed and this is something that I really like in military fantasy, which this book is not military fantasy per se, but it was for the period of the Civil War, during the parts where it dealt with the war directly and with the Colonel Buendia. It had a military fantasy feel. So I liked the way that it showed that there were people on both sides of the war who were, dedicated and devoted to the ideological projects of the war, but it also showed that there were these opportunists and people that were involved in the war that were just, interested in the power grab, and people that were, soldiers in the war who sort of lost their grip on the ideological project of the war,
right,
and became more invested in like the war itself and be in the life of a soldier, and that there became a certain camaraderie between people on both sides of the conflict, like the colonel, for example, and one of the leaders, I forget his name, who was on the conservative side of the war. They developed a certain respect and camaraderie for each other, as they realized how out of touch a lot of the politicians and officers on both sides of the conflict were with their ideological projects, and that how like dishonorable a lot of the slimy elements involved in the war were, and they came to their own agreements at multiple points in the story with each other about how to deal with the war, and that was really interesting. I said I wanted to talk about foreshadowing during the spoiler part, and a big part of the war was that from the very first page, even before you know anything about the war at all, you get, this foreshadowing of when he was facing the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano was Aureliano Buendia, right? Colonel Aureliano Buendia would think back to this moment, and when he was facing the firing squad, he would think back to this moment and think this about it. And you get this foreshadowing the entire time for, as he's facing the fire squad, he's going to think about this, and then when we get to the firing squad, we think we know that he's going to be shot and killed by the firing squad, and that doesn't end up being what happens. So that was like a nice subversion of the foreshadowing. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really nice. I really like how the author used the foreshadowing to make us think something was going to happen that ended up not happening.
Right. Did you have anything else to say about either the Civil War or the politics of the Civil War or the foreshadowing?
Not really.
All right. Well, then let's talk about one of the big climactic moments that was dealt with in this book, which was the strike of the banana workers and the massacre of the strikers. Why don't you talk about that?
So this is actually based on the Banana Massacre of 1928. Of course, he changed things. Nobody knows how many people actually were murdered in that, but it's so it's based on a historical fact. In the book, it feels like so much is leading up with these workers, and then
So the one of the Buendias, I honestly forget which one because I can't keep them straight.
It's hard.
Gets involved in the plight of the banana workers and starts organizing them into a union. And they initially attempt to seek legal redress through the Supreme Courts and the local courts, and the company, which is supposed to be kind of a stand-in for the United Fruit Company, which is who the real, perpetrators of this event were, an American company that did a lot of shady and horrible things in Latin America. The Banana Company resorted to all sorts of legal trickery in the court system to subvert the workers. At one point, they pretended that the CEO had been shot dead, and so could not be addressed with the demands of the workers, even though that turned out later to not have been the case. They, at another point, pretended that the workers did not exist because the Macondo workers were all treated as temporary, subcontractors, basically, and not workers, so they could not deal with the demands of the workers because there were no workers to make demands, which, as many people who may work in Uber, Lyft, other companies that pretend that their workers are subcontractors so they don't have to grant them any rights or acknowledge their bargaining power or bargaining units. No, this is a common trick that companies will resort to, and the United Fruit Company did resort to this. They did treat in the real Colombia, not in the condo, they did treat their workers as subcontractors. And there was all of this sort of tomfoolery, which led to the workers deciding to go on strike several times. One of the times that they went on strike, they demanded, they limited, in the book, they limited their demands to only being off on Sunday for the Sabbath, which was deemed as so reasonable by the priests in Macondo and the authorities, relevant authorities, that that demand was endorsed. And of course, this mirrors the banana workers' demand for a 6-day work week in the real world. And it all ended up culminating in this situation where with the company continuing to jerk the union and the workers around with their demands, they ended up assembling in the public square, supposedly for a meeting with the bosses to negotiate. And there were thousands of workers present in the book, and the military was there. The company representatives were not, and there was a huge massacre. Thousands of workers were killed in this massacre, and the Buendia fellow, whose name I can't remember, who was present there and who was one of the organizers, ends up unconscious, and he wakes up on a train full of corpses that are being taken out to the ocean to dump the bodies. And he ends up escaping and going back to the Buendia home. And the government and the company pretend that there was no massacre. They round up anybody who talks about the massacre and make them disappear. The CEO says, and here's a great use of magical realism. The CEO says, well, now we've decided to agree to the demands of the workers, which we will do so as soon as the rain stops. And there hadn't been rain in Macondo for years and years and years, or at least not steady. And as soon as he says, as soon as the rain stops, it starts raining, and it rains for 4 years, during which time the banana company packs up and goes elsewhere to exploit Latin American workers in other parts of the world.
Yes.
So yeah, what did you think about the banana strike? Did I leave anything out, or is there anything you want to say about it?
Basically, it's heartbreaking because it is based on real experiences, and in the real history, when the massacre occurred, it wasn't just the workers, it was their family, it was their children. Young children were massacred, their wives were massacred. They literally killed everybody that was there.
Yeah, and I think they did deal with that in the book. There were there was somebody who said something about their mother that the Buendia viewpoint character heard before he was unconscious.
Right.
So I do think that was sort of casually or peripherally brought up in the book. The storytelling is a little strange. The narrator's kind of this loose, zoomed out narrator who tells the story like an oral history, but then you get zoomed in on a character's perspective sometimes for a little bit,
which I do
and then
really
it detaches. Yeah, no, it's great. It is a great narration style, and we'll talk more about who the narrator is when we talk about the ending. What else did you? Sorry, I think I interrupted you. What else did you have to say about the strike?
There's nothing.
Nothing else?
We covered it.
Okay. Let's see. Did that, I think. Oh, the Remedios the Beauty, another example of magical realism. There was a beautiful woman who was, I think, adopted into the Buendia family, or did she marry into the Buendia family? Her name was Remedios, and she lived on the Buendia estate for a while at least.
She married?
Yeah, okay. No. She didn't, because the way her story ends.
Yes,
so she must have been adopted.
Right.
So this young woman was very ignorant of the world, very innocent. She moves into the Buendia estate, and there's a little bit of an argument within the Buendia family about whether she's really innocent, or the colonel thinks that she really knows, so much that her wisdom appears to be an ignorant innocence.
That.
And she is she has a scent, like a pheromonic excretion that where her beauty is intoxicating to men, and it makes them do stupid things. This guy is on the roof, fixing the roof, and accidentally sees her through a missing part of the roof or something, and he's so stupefied by the scent, by her beautiful scent, that he falls off the roof and breaks his skull. And there's shortly after that, there's a scene where there are men just turn into rabid dogs, chasing her and killing each other to try to be with her or whatever. And when the guy falls off the roof, he doesn't have blood coming out of his skull. It's the substance, the nectarish substance that comes from this pheromonic magical sense. And I just could not help but thinking of, if for those of you that have watched the old Canadian skit comedy show Kids in the Hall, there's this hilarious skit from Kids in the Hall where a guy goes into work and he forgot his deodorant, and his pits are covered in sweat, and the his boss smells his armpits and realizes that he excretes this like wonderful, intoxicating perfume, and they start bottling it up as perfume and selling it on the market, and people stop going to work because they're so entranced by this guy's armpit stink. And the economy crashes because nobody's going to work, so they have to like use concrete to like seal up his armpits and no one will ever smell it again. And yeah, that's the connection I made as soon as this guy fell off the roof.
They might have gotten that idea from it. Who knows?
Yeah, they might have. I mean, I don't know if the kids in the hall watched or read the 100 Years of Solitude, or any of the writers did. But before we talk about the ending, is there anything else you want to talk about with the story or characters or plot or?
One character I really liked was Ursula, and for
yeah.
somehow we didn't mention her. I don't know how.
I don't know how we avoided it. She's basically the main
Right.
protagonist, although not the narrative viewpoint, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, talk about Ursula.
Yeah, so Ursula is a really important matriarch that you kind of follow around. And there's like foreshadowing with her, and she makes these fantastical predictions of, oh, it's bad omen that if we find this, and a lot of the story kind of revolves around her viewpoint. Like, it comes back to her a lot. And I think you said this to me, but I also got that perspective when I read it the first time, was when she dies near the end of the book, it seems like, oh, this should be the ending. That, it
right,
seems like,
because it seems like she's the protagonist for the whole book, and then
yes, and so it gets a little hard. That actually, after her death, that's the slowest part of the book for me for a minute. But you've got to stick through that part because it's really beautiful the way it's tied at the end. It's done very well, and I'm very happy with the way that that's tied in.
Ursula's a great character, and I love her superstitious curmudgeonliness, and how she's just afraid of the corruption of the family, and she tries to raise one of the kids to be the next pope because of how corrupt and insane the entire family is.
And she's like, oh, if these two people get together, there'll be a kid born with a pigtail. That was like one of the things you were talking about.
Right.
But also, one of the things I really like, and I'm trying to remember this exactly, was it like 3 people came to her house and asked her to watch money or something?
Right. They left. No, she didn't know who it was.
Right.
So they didn't ask her. But during the war, 3 guys came to the house, and they left these like supposed relics, like holy relics.
Relics, that's what it is.
That were like depictions of a saint.
Yes.
Which
and there's symbolism with that too.
Which she prayed to, because she's a Catholic character. She prayed to these depictions of I forget which saints, and then she realized that actually the relics were made up of gold, which means she actually was sinning when she prayed to them, because she was, she was bowing down to an image of like a golden figure, basically, that wasn't, and it wasn't, God that she was worshiping. It was this golden, kind of like a symbolism for the golden calf. But she so she had the relics like melted down into gold bars or gold something, and buried them, and waited to try to learn who the treasure belonged to, and wanted them to come back for it, and kept it as a secret for many, many years. And eventually it came out, and some of the characters went insane and died trying to figure out where the treasure was buried, and which leads up pretty well into the ending, actually, if you wanted to transition into talking about the ending. Or did you have more to say about Ursula?
No, just that she thought it was a very bad omen, the treasure,
Right. A bad omen, especially given that she committed blasphemy. So the ending. Let's talk about the ending.
Go for it.
Well, at the end of the book, it's revealed that these textbooks that had been left by this gypsy who had influenced the family for many years, had influenced the original patriarch of the family who founded the town of Macondo, and had visited the town many times, ended up coming back to Macondo after he was supposedly dead, and living with the Buendias, and staying with them and retiring there and eventually dying, that he had left behind these books that nobody could read or understand, and that the books ended up being written in Sanskrit and in a cipher, if I've got this right. And one of the very last Buendias, after his wife dies in childbirth, and he gets drunk and lets his newborn baby die and get eaten by ants who carry the baby's body away from him on his on his last day and the last day of the town of Macondo. And he, as his baby is being carried away by these ants, he's deciphered the books that this gypsy left behind. What's the guy's name? I forget. Marquedes, yeah. The gypsy Marquedes had left these behind, and he deciphers it, and he's reading it, and he realizes that what he's reading is the past, present, and future of the town of Macondo as narrated by Mercedes, which is the book that you're reading, 100 Years of Solitude. And so you find out that you find out at the end that the narrator is Mercedes, and that he wrote down things that happened after his death in this cipher in Sanskrit for this guy to read. And the guy is reading it, and as he's reading it, he starts skipping ahead to the end of the book to see like when he dies, which is how he finds out that he never leaves that room, and that the town and he will end like right there in that room on that day. And it's just a mind-blowing, mind-fuck of an ending. So, what did you think of the ending? Did it throw you for a loop, or were you surprised?
Yes, I was. And it, I think it's just a really beautiful ending. It really ties together things really well. And also something that we didn't mention is about how this town is like utopian, which is almost, a spoiler, so you kind of don't want to. It's like this utopian town that you see, and it starts out post-colonial, and the people start slowly coming in, and the gypsies come in with ice and stuff at first, and that's seen as like this really extravagant, really like almost magical thing, kind of. So like things like that are real are actually seen almost magical in a way, to the characters in Macondo. And then,
but flying carpets are totally normal,
right? But then, so it follows this utopian town, and then you see with the rise of colonialism,
or the resurgence,
of colonialism
in a new form.
Yeah, so it kind of ends. It's like this utopia. It's like utopia just ends, kind of.
Well, it ends. I feel like the utopia ends pretty early in the book because the town has like no politics supposedly at the beginning, which is totally utopian. And then like as their commerce with the rest of the country begins to pick up, and the government takes notice of them, they send people there to try to like intervene in the governing of the town, and then the civil war that's impending sort of gets brought into the town, and all of these people who've never thought about politics before are suddenly being asked to define themselves by, are you a liberal or are you conservative? And so you get that, and even that is kind of a utopia, in that the class struggle is still not brought into it until later when you get the Banana Company imperialism.
Right. See, I kind of thought it was like a gradual death of utopianism.
Right.
Because it does start early, but you see it as soon as people start coming. I think there was like a prophecy that one of the Buendias made about how, we don't want these people. It's not good that they're coming, but like everybody in the town was like all happy they were coming or whatever. I can't remember. Do you remember that?
I don't.
I feel like there was some kind of prophecy.
Though I do remember a major prophecy we haven't talked about, which is the idea of time being a circle.
Yes.
in Macondo, which is Ursula's prophecy. She believes that the same events are happening over and over and over, and the family tragedies are repeating themselves in a slightly different form. But she thinks that the madness of her late husband is being passed down, and that people who bear one set of names in the family are going to be this way, and people who bear another name are going to be that way, and that it's all just spiraling around. And this is sort of borne out by the ending, where at the end, Mercedes' texts are translated, and then it's basically the apocalypse, and Macondo's just wiped off the map.
Yes.
So, yeah. But I don't remember the prophecy you were just referring to.
I thought it was her husband, actually. Not sure.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Maybe I'm making it up.
Maybe. I don't know. I guess we'll have to reread this at some point. Maybe come back to it. Yeah. Anything else? Final thoughts about 100 Years of Solitude?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. So I'm Christian.
Whitney.
And that was 100 Years of Solitude. And we'll be back together again at the very latest for the discussion of The Blade itself by Joe Abercrombie. So check that out. Dark Portent signing off.